So the idea that what an academic who's interested in the environment does is write very good scholarship and then hope that it kind of trickles down to students who somehow, some of them down the road will make some decisions and some changes. I think that's an inadequate response.
And that was the voice of Imre Szeman, who was recently interviewed by Amy Zhang in conjunction with the Cultural Studies Colloquium at George Mason University. The Cultural Studies program at George Mason University is a center for interdisciplinary research and doctoral training. This year's Colloquium series examines capitalism and climate change. How did we get into this mess? And where do we go from here? This podcast series will explore these questions for a wider audience.
Hi, welcome. I'm Amy Zhang. I'm a PhD student in the Cultural Studies program at George Mason University. As part of our Cultural Studies Colloquium, we've invited several speakers to join us for this Colloquium Speaker Series. Today, I'm speaking with Imre Szeman, who is the University Research Chair of Communication Arts at University of Waterloo. Thank you for joining us, Imre.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
Can you help us by defining petrocultures, which is what your work has been on for a while now?
I would be happy to tell you what petrocultures is all about. So petrocultures is simultaneously a critical analytic term. It's also a term that's meant to do a certain kind of political work of doing some changes in how we treat the environment. And there's a third part to petrocultures, which is a bit harder to define, but that's an experimentation with new ways of doing academic research. So let me talk about each of these, not too long, but I think it's important to keep them separate and to talk about each of these in turn. So petrocultures really began as a group of us at the University of Alberta that were trying to make sense of exactly what was happening to the community that we lived in, Edmonton, as Canada became a oil superpower at the beginning of this century. The tar sands, which are located, the Athabasca tar sands located north of Edmonton, is one of the largest sites of oil on the planet. Some say it's the second largest reserves on the planet. And it only started to become a site of extraction really in the last 20 years or so because of new technologies that allowed that site to be fiscally feasible. Before that, couldn't make money on it. It was too difficult to get the sands away from the oil. So when you have a place where a lot of people are suddenly coming to try to make a lot of money, it really changes the character of the place that you live in. And so I think our first impulse was just to try to make sense of what was happening in Canada, what was happening in Edmonton, when suddenly we became an oil-rich superpower, which Canada remains to this day. But as soon as we started to do this kind of research, really we immediately began asking bigger questions. And it's these bigger questions that have defined petrocultures. And it's really questions about what is energy for? What do we do with energy in our society? Why don't we talk about energy more, given how important it is to us? And it's through those kinds of questions that I think we define this idea of what petrocultures are. And when I tell you what petrocultures are, it's not going to sound very interesting, or it's going to sound perhaps to be an overstatement. But what petrocultures are is the culture that we live in. It's everything that we do, our capacities, how we imagine ourselves, what we think we should do with our lives, how we do those things. All of those things are a petroculture. It's a way of saying that the culture of modernity could not be what it is without the energies that we have. And the term petroculture is an attempt to draw attention to the fact that we have not been having a discussion about the role that energy plays in shaping contemporary society. It's something that on one level we all understand, and at another level we don't understand it. And just to kind of tell you why we thought it's important to try to make sense of this, it really has to do with two different things. One is that unless we understand who we are, unless we understand the petrocultures we inhabit, it'll become very difficult for us to make an energy transition. A transition away from fossil fuel-based societies to other forms of energy. The other thing is that unless we grapple with how we are a petroculture, it will become very hard for us to make any kind of real impact on climate change. So Petroculture is kind of trying to stick our face in the tar sands in a way, or stick our face in the oil all around us that shapes who we are, so that we can begin to have a discussion about how it has made us who we are.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you so much. Do you see a contradiction in the ways that modernity has been reliant on energy consumption, on the consumption of fossil fuels, and our hopes for development in the future? Are there any sorts of visions of development that don't involve energy extraction the way that we have been using energy now?
That's an excellent question. I would say that at the present, we don't have any real visions about what a future might look like without oil extraction. There are ideas out there about what a society might look like in the future. Of course, there are. A lot of these societies are kind of versions of an Elon Musk society. So instead of fossil fuel cars, we have electric cars. And the thing I guess we would want to draw attention to is that the thing there that's still not being asked is that, or question is the necessity of the car itself. So no matter what, it seems like we desperately want the car. We desperately want what the car gives us, which is a certain kind of freedom and autonomy that we have become used to having as part of creatures of modernity. So that's really what the petroculture element is, less than kind of the actual fossil fuel. The fossil fuels create this kind of sense of our capacities, of who we are, and that's what we want to kind of unnerve. I think that there are not really visions that have truly paid a lot of attention to exactly what kind of society you will need globally, where you cannot rely on this energy source, either because this energy source is actually in short supply. There's not an infinite supply of an organic matter, which is what fossil fuels are, or because of the damage that it does to climate. We can't continue to use it. So there has to be some kind of discussion and some kind of future vision where you have two things happening at once that are very, very difficult. On the one hand, you need a change in practices of energy use by those who use a lot of energy. And yet you still need what I think we want as a kind of a development, an expansion of modernity for lots of the parts of the world that don't yet have that modernity, don't have that opportunity. How we're going to do that, how we're going to both reduce and expand at the same time is what I see as one of the central contradictions. So you have countries like China and India, other developing countries that are continuing to use fossil fuels and even using it on an expanded level, even though they're very attuned to the impacts on climate. The tendency has been that we imagine a technological solution to all these things. And that's one of the things that I think those of us who do work in petrocultures are most critical of and attuned to. Yeah. That what takes the place right now of any discussion at all about energy in publics is the projections that things like Wired magazine shows us, where we will have solar paneled everything. And that seems to take care of the need to like kind of attend to the types of creatures we've become, the types of culture we've developed. We can continue to have a petroculture just powered by other things. That's the hope, because the other sets of things we'd have to do are extraordinarily difficult politically. And just as we have been with climate change and global warming, this seems to be something that both North American society, but global society is really unwilling to have a serious discussion about it. I feel like we haven't even begun to have the kinds of discussions that we need to have. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. If I'm hearing you right, I can see how the response to a situation that seems so familiar, seems so at home for those in the global north, you can sort of only respond to it with this kind of magical thinking. And yeah, I understand that is a huge problem. So you mentioned before that petrocultures is, in one way, it's the culture that we live in. It is this very immediate, very familiar presence of modernity in the global north. And I wonder if there is a way in which oil and energy, which are, of course, underneath all of the artifacts of our lived experience, our cultural practices, if there's a way in which they're not conspicuous in everyday life.
I think they are not conspicuous. And I think this is what has been the most difficult thing to have a discussion about. I mean, on the one hand, you tell anybody at all that fossil fuels are important to us, they will, of course, immediately say that that's the case.
Yes.
If you tell them that all manner of plastics and all manner of other goods are also part of fossil fuels, they come from fossil fuels, of course, they will also tell you that as well. The more difficult thing is to tell them that the kind of way that they imagine what it is to be a person are also part of fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. That's so much more difficult to imagine. So the idea that you can move as an individual in the United States, for instance, anywhere you want. I mean, there are, of course, there's limitations of class and race that are built into this as well. But there's this sense of kind of capacity to go. There's this capacity to do. There's even the feeling of free time. The way that we have tended to link maturity with the ability to drive. Mm-hmm. The comfort of home and of family and their connections to suburbs, which come at the same moment. They develop at the very same moment as the rest of the Great Expansion, the first suburbs being in 1947. The sensibility that we have about what it is to make it. I mean, these, I think, are the more difficult things to connect up with energy, connect up with a surfeit of energy. And the idea that this then has to be altered is hard, obviously, to address. It is to say almost, I mean, what we're asking is that people begin to imagine a kind of a social revolution, a political transformation, unlike anything they've ever imagined. It isn't getting different people into the halls of Congress. It's about trying to think about what those people, how they're constituted. Uh-huh. There's a phrase that I really like by the historian Dipesh Chakrabarty, who's given some thought to these issues. He says something to the effect that the mansion of modern freedoms is built on fossil fuels. So even the kind of ideas that we have about what constitutes a democracy, as flawed as they might be, they are linked to this energetic capacity that is still so new, I think, that we're unaware of it. It doesn't come really with the first discovery of fossil fuels in North America. It comes with the expansion of the economy, of consumerism, of the use of all kinds of goods following World War II. We're living that expansion. That's something that is tangible to us. It's something that is one generation away. My mother was born in 1945. It's not ancient history. It's familiar to us. And it's that familiarity that makes it so difficult to undo in some ways.
Right. Yeah, I understand that. So I wonder, because I know that you have collaborated with artists and you have also written about the visual arts and film. I wonder if you see those creators of cultural objects as being one potential source of this counter-narrative, or maybe just a directive for society to be looking reflexively on this condition.
I would say that up until now, the arts have been as guilty of not attending to this cultural imaginary as the rest of society.
Okay.
So in a book that I find to be very provocative and interesting, Amitav Ghosh, the writer and critic, his book's called The Great Derangement. He asks, why is it that even in the last couple of decades, the books, the novels, literary fiction that is celebrated, gets prizes like the Man Booker, none of them pay any attention to the environment for the most part. This is something missing in serious literary fiction. I think that can be said of a lot of the other arts as well. Now, that is something that is changing. And I think that we have to turn to culture and the arts as a place where there is an ability to intervene in everyday culture, to cause people to reflect on the situations that they are inhabiting, to create other kinds of possibilities. I think that is definitely where it has to occur. I think it's occurring in places that up until perhaps recently have still not been taken that seriously in genres like science fiction or climate fiction. These are places that have the ability to tell us what happens if we don't make changes and to give us ideas about what happens if we do.
Sure.
An interesting genre, but which is still a kind of a failed genre, I think, is solar punk.
Really?
Which is a genre that tries to do something a little bit bizarre. It's trying to be not apocalyptic. It's trying to suggest that solar was taken on, that there was this transformation, and then it's trying to write narratives about that. And not in kind of again, I always use this as a shorthand because I think people know what it means. It's not in an Elon Musk way, but it was difficult, something happened, but they want to provide narratives of something on the other side. So I do think, I'm kind of giving you two answers, I guess, that are very opposite. I'm saying that on the one hand, I think it's not been the case that contemporary culture has attended to these issues.
Yes.
On the other hand, I think that's where a lot of the kind of work has to be done. Now, when I say that contemporary culture hasn't done this kind of work, I will inevitably generate all kinds of responses from people. They'll say everything like, they'll say Melville's Moby Dick was actually about the pursuit of a certain kind of fuel. There's Upton Sinclair's Oil. There's kind of things that will come out of the woodwork in a sense, and it'll be treated as if it's evidence of kind of a counter evidence to what I'm saying.
Okay.
But I think those are really kind of exceptions. And it's also the case that those are not really attending to the hegemonic character of this particular fuel and shaping us. There are examples of fuel in these places, in these kind of documents, but they're kind of more like, they're like setting or they're like cause. Like I'll just give you two other examples. One is the TV show Dallas, rich family in Texas. But it's just really a source of their wealth. It doesn't ever appear in the narrative in any kind of way.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Could be said about the movie Giant, where an old movie now perhaps, but again, it's kind of the source of wealth. It's what drives a family apart and messes them up because somebody makes a killing on oil and it's going to create, it's going to unnerve this family that were a cattle family. So I'm not that interested in it being a thematic part. I wanted to do this other kind of work that we've been talking about.
Okay. That's interesting. Thank you. I think cultural studies also shares the view that there is a potential for members of the creators of culture to make some of these narratives that can be interventions and useful interventions. Great. I am aware that you've done a lot of work also on globalization and that it's a contested concept for you. I wonder if you can tie together what you see happening to globalization as we enter an energy scarce future.
Wow, that's a really interesting question. So globalization as narrative, as political impulse, has to be really kept apart from globalization as another kind of sets of practices. I mean, you can have globalization that is effectively a name for neoliberalism or modes of contemporary governmentality. And one can also speak about globalization as a practice that is being carried out when nations come together to try to think about how they share an environmental commons and how perhaps then they should make decisions on a common basis about energy. So those I think have to be kept apart. I think that the things that I've written about globalization are always trying to raise awareness about the kind of the parlor trick of globalization, the way in which it's saying we're all one planet now. And so lots of kinds of things that were a problem when we had this older vocabulary of developed countries and developing countries, it suddenly gets taken care of all at once. Or globalization as a mechanism by which capital uses different spaces of labor in order to maximize profit. That kind of the reality of globalization that lies underneath the kind of the language, the easy language of globalization is something I've drawn kind of attention to.
Yes.
I think though, I mean, I've really tried to think about this in relationship to petrocultures, and there does seem to me to be some utility in activating a different idea of globalization. Because whatever else is the case, it does not seem to me to be fruitful or to likely have a positive outcome if we have a situation where 180 or so countries each make determinations about their own CO2 levels that they're comfortable with, and each make their own determinations about how much energy they'll use, simply because we all share a common planet, and CO2 doesn't need a passport. It was telling that at the Paris COP21 event, when all of the countries put together the CO2 levels that they were willing to limit themselves to, the total amount of CO2, you would need a planet 6 times the size if you were to want to keep it under 1.5 degrees Celsius, the expansion of the globe. Some have said this is the first time that the group of nations sort of really saw this. They really understood this. And part of, I think, the push towards keeping the Paris Accord on the part of a lot of nations is that they recognize how there has to be a common decision about these things. However flawed Paris Accord is, which is very, very flawed, it does seem to me that the necessity of having a global decision on environmental issues is an important one. It does have some kind of repercussions for how politics work that are things that I will continue to try to figure out. I mean, one of the things that I will be talking about in the future, working on in the future, is questions around energy commons, what that means, or energy justice. It's kind of a way of making clear who gets what, who has what kind of power some people have and what kind of power other people don't, and what are the environmental implications of what they have and what they don't have.
Okay. Thank you. I know that you've spent a lot of your time both sort of working as a discipline builder for energy humanities, and I know that you also spend a lot of time working outside of academia with advocacy groups, artists. And I wonder if you can give us a sense of how you make decisions for how to spend your time and resources in academia, in doing academic production or doing production outside.
Another great question. I guess I would have to first say I make my decisions very, very poorly, and I tend to be much too overworked. But I think that what I ultimately keep in mind for myself, what's really, really important, that I keep the questions and the issues that motivate me front and center, above and beyond everything else. So I don't really worry about how I fit in disciplines, or how I speak to different disciplines, or whether I'm asking the right questions or not, according to some disciplines. Mm-hmm. What I'm motivated by are questions and issues that I feel merit academic scholarship and academic attention, and then I try to address them however I can. Some of the ways of addressing that necessitate speaking to communities outside of the academy. So certainly advocacy groups, NGOs, e-NGOs, some elements of government, even some elements of industry, they are all aspects of a broader social that are connected to the specific questions around energy that I'm currently interested in. And I worry that what is happening to some degree in the academy, especially in kind of this broader area of the environmental humanities, is that there's a very compelling kind of critical analysis going on, but the political element is missing insofar as if it's important to ask questions about the environment, it has to be the moment when those questions and those the result of those questions are activated, because there's not a situation where we can wait. Everything actually should be happening with respect to the environment today or yesterday, not 10 years from now or 20 years from now. So the idea that what an academic who's interested in the environment does is write very good scholarship, as my colleagues certainly do, And it's hopefully I try to do, and then hope that it kind of trickles down to students who somehow, some of them down the road will make some decisions and some changes. I think that's an inadequate response. And so I think as long as I keep to the front and center the questions that are important to me, then I try to connect up to whatever degree I can with the communities that I feel I can benefit from learning how they're approaching these issues, but also who might benefit from the research we're doing. And also, I want to know how collectively we might have a different kind of impact and generate different kinds of knowledge than we might if we stayed in our silos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. It doesn't sound like that's bad decision making at all. It sounds like those are really good principles. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think cultural studies students like myself, it would do well to remember some of that too, as we try to work both in academia and outside.
I think what has been important to cultural studies as the non-field that it is over its history, which is now half a century old, it's no longer something that one has to apologize for. It's an important way of addressing academic knowledge, is that from its very origins, what it tried to attend to and push the focus of academics towards are issues that were right in front of them, but that weren't being asked. So we needn't always turn back to the Birmingham School as a kind of progenitors of cultural studies. But I think what one does find there are scholars who attended to the problems right in front of them. A lot of what was done in British cultural studies were almost like the writing of white papers back in response to what was happening in government. That, I think, is something we could take a really good lesson from. If we did the kind of work that the early Stuart Hall did, or other members of the Birmingham School, with respect to, for instance, a culture in which policing was in crisis, the name of a book in early cultural studies, I think we would do a different kind of work. Certainly, policing is in crisis again in many countries, and there could be a really different kind of work in relationship to them than doing a verso book or doing a book for a press. I think that the kinds of insights about the complexity of culture and society and the ways that identity and race and gender and power and class get played out in these societies in connection now to things like the environment, social media, energy, these demand analyses and insights of kinds of scholars that want to have an impact. Cultural studies to me has always meant culture and power.
Yes.
And power continues to be exercised via culture in the strongest way possible. And so the issues should drive the analysis, but also the analysis should be pointed towards places where it can make an impact. And that does take place in the academy, but it can also happen elsewhere. There are other people to whom we should be speaking and speaking more often.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for your questions.
Thanks again for listening to this interview, which is a production of George Mason University's Cultural Studies Department. Be sure to tune in the coming weeks for more similar episodes on our theme of climate, capitalism, and culture. Also, be sure to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts so that you don't miss out on upcoming episodes.